At 2:37 p.m. on February 19, 1945, on the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, a U.S. Marine flamethrower team reported that it was still advancing toward the base of Mount Suribachi. That report should not have existed. By that point in the landing, the assault beaches were saturated with fire. Japanese positions, buried deep into the rock and ash, had survived the naval bombardment largely intact. Machine guns and mortars fired from concealed apertures. Artillery ranged the beaches precisely. Casualties mounted faster than units could reorganize. The flamethrower teams were among the most exposed elements on the beach. Their equipment was heavy, volatile, and immediately identifiable to defenders. Japanese doctrine treated flamethrower operators as priority targets. Survival rates were low once they were identified. The team advancing toward Suribachi had already lost its escort. One Marine was wounded. Another carried damaged equipment. The ground offered no cover beyond shallow shell craters that collapsed under weight. Every step forward drew fire. According to amphibious assault doctrine, a team in that condition was expected to halt, consolidate, or withdraw to await reinforcement. Continuing forward without infantry support, across open ground, against fortified positions, was considered untenable. Yet the team kept moving. They advanced in short bursts, closing the distance to the mountain while Japanese fire continued unabated. Hours later, they reached the outer defenses of Suribachi and remained operational long enough to support the clearance of positions that had dominated the landing beaches since dawn. In official summaries, the reduction of Suribachi is described as systematic and inevitable. Flamethrower teams are listed as assets employed in sequence. Casualties are recorded. No explanation is given for how isolated teams survived long enough to reach their objectives under conditions that destroyed entire platoons. From a distance, the outcome appears foreordained by numbers and firepower. From the beach, it depended on whether a few men could continue moving after the environment stripped away every advantage they were supposed to have. This is not a story about symbolic images or iconic moments. It is a story about how survival and progress occurred when exposure was total, support was absent, and stopping was as dangerous as moving. Iwo Jima was unlike any battlefield the Marines had encountered before. The island was small, barren, and composed almost entirely of volcanic ash that absorbed shock but provided no stability. Footing was uncertain. Vehicles bogged down. Foxholes collapsed as soon as they were dug. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern end of the island. Its slopes concealed a network of tunnels, bunkers, and firing positions carved directly into rock. Japanese defenders could move internally without exposure, appearing and disappearing at will. Positions were mutually supporting, with overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. The landing beaches offered no natural cover. The black sand reflected heat and smoke. Movement was slow and exhausting. Equipment weighed men down, and each step sank several inches before release. Wounded Marines struggled to move at all. Visibility fluctuated constantly. Smoke from naval bombardment mixed with dust kicked up by artillery impacts. At times, defenders were invisible until they fired. Sound traveled poorly, making it difficult to identify the direction of threats. Flamethrower teams operated under extreme constraints. The M2 flamethrower weighed over 70 pounds when fueled. Fuel tanks were vulnerable to bullet penetration. Operators moved slowly and could not drop their equipment without rendering themselves useless. Their purpose was narrow but critical: neutralize bunkers that could not be reduced by small arms fire. To do that, they had to approach within short range, often directly into fields of fire that had already devastated attacking infantry. Supply assumptions failed early. Ammunition and fuel resupply was inconsistent. Casualties among engineers and support troops reduced coordination. Communication was unreliable amid constant noise and destruction. The tactical environment reduced survival to a simple equation: advance under fire, reach a position close enough to be effective, or be pinned down and destroyed in place. There was no middle ground. The flamethrower team consisted of 3 Marines: the operator, the assistant, and a rifleman assigned for close protection. All were in their early 20s. None had prior combat experience before the Pacific Campaign. The operator, Private First Class Daniel Ruiz, had worked as a farm laborer in southern Texas before enlisting. He was accustomed to carrying heavy loads over uneven ground and working long hours under heat. His training evaluations described him as steady and physically resilient rather than aggressive. The assistant, Private Harold McNally, came from a machine shop background in Ohio. He understood valves, pressure, and the importance of preventing leaks under stress. In combat, that translated into constant attention to equipment condition, even while under fire. The rifleman, Corporal Frank Lewis, had been promoted shortly before the landing. He was responsible for watching approaches, returning fire when possible, and signaling movement. His role was not to lead, but to prevent surprise during the team's advance. None of them expected to move far beyond the beach on the first day. Their briefings emphasized supporting nearby infantry, not advancing independently toward a major objective. When units around them stalled or were destroyed, their situation changed faster than orders could adapt. The decision to keep moving did not come from a formal command. It emerged from circumstance. Staying meant remaining in a killing zone already saturated with fire. Moving offered exposure, but also the possibility of reaching ground where their equipment could matter. Their backgrounds did not prepare them for heroics. They prepared them for endurance, continuing to function under discomfort, uncertainty, and risk without waiting for ideal conditions. Those habits, formed long before Iwo Jima, would determine whether the team remained pinned on the sand or reached the base of the mountain alive. The Marine Corps' assault doctrine for Iwo Jima was built on sequential reduction. Infantry would land first, secure footholds, and suppress visible defenses. Engineers and flamethrower teams would then be brought forward deliberately, protected by riflemen and automatic weapons, to neutralize bunkers one by one. Progress was expected to be methodical, expensive, but controlled. That system assumed spacing. It assumed that infantry units could advance far enough inland to create lanes of movement. It assumed that suppressive fire would keep defenders pinned long enough for specialist teams to operate. It assumed communication between squads, platoons, and supporting arms would remain intact as the fight progressed. At Iwo Jima, those assumptions collapsed almost immediately. Japanese defenses were not arranged to be reduced in sequence. They were designed to absorb bombardment and then re-emerge intact. Suppressive fire had limited effect against concealed apertures. Infantry advances stalled within minutes of landing. Units intermingled. Command relationships blurred. For flamethrower teams, the failure of spacing was decisive. They were supposed to move behind infantry screens. Instead, infantry screens evaporated under fire. The teams found themselves exposed in the open, their presence drawing attention without the protection doctrine required. Communication failures compounded the problem. Radios were destroyed or overwhelmed. Hand signals were lost in smoke and dust. Orders, when they arrived, no longer matched the reality on the ground. The system did not disappear. It became irrelevant. What remained was intent without structure. The objective, neutralize Suribachi's defenses, still existed. The prescribed method no longer did. Flamethrower teams were now operating in an environment where following doctrine increased risk rather than reduced it. The system had been designed to manage firepower and casualties at scale. It was not designed to guide 3 men crossing open volcanic sand without support. The critical decision occurred not at a command post, but in a shallow crater halfway between the waterline and the base of Suribachi. Ruiz's team had advanced in short bursts, each movement costing energy and drawing fire. Their escort was gone. Nearby units were pinned or destroyed. Smoke shifted unpredictably, offering brief concealment followed by sudden exposure. At that point, the team faced 2 options. The first was to stop and dig in. That aligned with instinct and training. It reduced immediate exposure and allowed them to conserve strength. It also meant remaining in a zone already targeted by artillery and machine guns. Digging into volcanic ash offered little protection. Remaining stationary increased the likelihood of eventual destruction. The second option was to continue moving forward, alone. Advancing meant crossing ground under observation, carrying equipment that marked them as high-value targets. It meant committing to close-range engagement without guarantee of support. Ruiz chose to move. The decision was not framed as bravery. It was framed as probability. The crater would not protect them for long. Remaining there invited inevitable targeting. Movement, however dangerous, introduced uncertainty into the defenders' calculations. Once the team left the crater, the decision could not be reversed easily. Fatigue increased. Ammunition dwindled. The distance to Suribachi shortened, but so did their margin for error. The team accepted that if they stopped again, it would be because they could no longer move. Survival during the advance depended on timing, restraint, and minimizing exposure rather than eliminating threat. The team moved only when smoke, dust, or explosions obscured visibility. Ruiz coordinated movement by touch and brief verbal cues. No one ran. Running increased the risk of falling and rupturing fuel lines. Movement was steady and deliberate. Lewis fired sparingly, not to suppress, but to disrupt. Short bursts were aimed at apertures that had just fired, forcing defenders to shift attention momentarily. That brief distraction was enough to gain a few more yards. McNally monitored the flamethrower constantly. He checked pressure gauges, listened for leaks, and adjusted valves while moving. Fuel was conserved aggressively. The weapon would be useless if fired prematurely. Heat management became critical. The equipment trapped heat against Ruiz's body. Dehydration accelerated. Breathing was shallow. The team paused only long enough to slow heart rates before moving again. When fire intensified, the team went prone, hugging the sand despite its instability. They accepted minor burns and abrasions as preferable to silhouette exposure. Each pause was temporary. Staying down too long allowed enemy gunners to reacquire them. As they approached the base of Suribachi, terrain shifted slightly. Slopes increased. Rock replaced sand in places, offering marginally better cover. Japanese fire grew more concentrated, but also more predictable, coming from known apertures. The team's world narrowed to distance, timing, and equipment status. Survival was no longer about reaching the mountain quickly. It was about remaining functional long enough to reach it at all. By the time they reached the outer defenses, the team had expended most of its physical reserves. What they retained was just enough coordination to do what they had come to do: operate their equipment in a place where it mattered. The cost of reaching the base of Mount Suribachi became clear almost immediately once the team halted its forward movement. What they had gained in position, they paid for in physical depletion and vulnerability. Ruiz's legs shook uncontrollably as the flamethrower was finally brought off his shoulders. The weight that had driven him forward now left him unsteady. Heat rash and burns covered his back and neck, where fuel tanks pressed against skin for hours. Dehydration dulled his coordination, making even simple adjustments deliberate and slow. McNally's hands were raw from gripping valves and fittings while crawling across abrasive volcanic sand. His attention never left the weapon. Any leak, any pressure failure would turn the flamethrower from an asset into a liability. Fuel levels were lower than expected. The team had just enough for a limited number of controlled bursts. Lewis had expended most of his ammunition, providing brief, disruptive fire during the advance. His rifle barrel was hot to the touch. His role shifted from escort to warning, watching apertures, listening for movement in the rock, and signaling when enemy fire shifted. The terrain offered no relief. The slope funneled Japanese fire downward. Bunkers and cave entrances were closer now, increasing lethality rather than reducing it. The team's presence drew immediate attention. Japanese defenders redirected fire toward the base of the mountain, recognizing the threat flamethrowers posed to their tunnel network. Psychological strain intensified. The team knew they could not retreat across the ground they had just crossed. Any movement backward would expose them without momentum or surprise. Holding position meant remaining under observation. Every option carried risk. They were still operational. But the margin that allowed them to be operational was thin and shrinking. As additional Marine units pushed forward, the larger system began to reassert itself around Suribachi. Infantry closed distance incrementally. Supporting fires adjusted. Flamethrower teams like Ruiz's were folded into coordinated clearance efforts rather than operating alone. Their arrival mattered. The presence of flamethrowers at the mountain's base forced Japanese defenders to seal tunnels, relocate firing positions, or abandon certain apertures entirely. The balance shifted from static defense to forced reaction. At the command level, progress around Suribachi was logged as methodical advancement under heavy resistance. Flamethrower employment was noted as effective. Casualties were recorded. No special attention was given to how isolated teams reached positions doctrine assumed would be approached under protection. Ruiz's team was eventually relieved and rotated back. Medical checks documented dehydration, burns, and exhaustion. None were removed from duty permanently. Their experience blended into the broader attritional fight that would consume Iwo Jima for weeks. The system continued forward, absorbing individual endurance into collective momentum. The island would be taken, at enormous cost, through repetition rather than singular moments. Today, Mount Suribachi rises above Iwo Jima as a landmark more familiar for its summit than for the ground at its base, where progress was measured not in flags or photographs, but in yards gained under fire and the ability of exhausted men to keep moving, when stopping meant death. What history often condenses into iconic images was, on the ground, a series of narrow decisions made without support, certainty, or relief, where survival depended on choosing the least fatal option again and again. If telling these grounded, carefully researched stories of war matters to you, subscribe to the channel to support our team and help ensure these histories continue to be preserved.